Show starts in 1 minute. Good evening, folks, and a hearty welcome to our drive-in theater. We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family.
Like 9 out of 10 film stars, Raquel Welch uses Lux Beauty Soap.
Well, no, I like to be a woman and a man to be a man, you know.
We hope you'll make this a weekly visit. You love the tasty array of snacks we have to offer. Bring your friends. There are always wonderful new pictures to see. We hope you have a wonderful time.
All right, and welcome back to another episode of the Longhouse, the show for the NPR. Sorry, I keep fumbling that lately. Also known as the NPR for the Sensible Centrist. And as I see in the chat now, those of you who haven't done your homework yet, I'm sorry, it is too late. I've already collected it, and we're going to go through it together now. So you'll just have to, pick it up as we go along. Luddic Path, welcome back for another week.
Yes, good to be back as usual to everybody's favorite civic nationalism, anti-woke, tranny reaction podcast. No.
Yes, remember to buy our anti-woke chocolate and buy
we have the mugs,
coffee, and
the t-shirts, and we'll link in the description for all of the merch. But in all seriousness, we had got an exciting episode in front of us. I got a new Praxarchy member on board this time, so everybody say hi to Carl Hermann Habermas, and maybe you could just introduce yourself quickly.
All right, hello, I'm Carl Hermann Habermas. I'm a writer for Praxarchy and probably the youngest person to grace this sphere. I have a background in Austrian economics, although that isn't necessarily my focus these days. My concerns are more on elite theory, questions of culture and the biospirit, and praxis for our movement in terms of how to attain power, or at least facilitate it, for the next generation to do so.
Okay, very good. And joining us from a couple of weeks ago, we also have Liquid Swan.
Thanks for having me. How you doing?
Doing good. It's been a busy week, but I managed to fit in another episode of The Longhouse, as always, of course. Do we want to just jump right into the article? Or did we want to? Actually, we want to talk to Carl first, because we have a question that we always ask our new guests. And that question is, how did you end up here? How did you end up writing the things that you write? How did you end up believing the things you believe? What is your red pilling story?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a big one. And I think as time goes on and new people enter the sphere, it's going to be not necessarily one red pilling incident. I'm compelled a lot by ideas such as evolutionary psychology, in that they hold a lot of explanatory power in how people manifest in the world, from their personality, disposition, how they present aesthetically, so on and so forth. And I was always what you'd call right-wing. I mean, before I was 5 years old, I distinctly recall asking my parents what it was to be gay, and they told me. I remember feeling an unparalleled sense of disgust and disquiet at the concept. It wasn't just this standard refrain of, ew, you might get with a child. There was this sort of deeper and innate feeling. And I told them in so many words as I could at 4 years old what I felt about that. And they told me to keep all these opinions to myself. And that was my first feeling of the West has fallen, so to speak. I mean, aside from playing,
you were the chud jack at a young age. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, very, very much so.
It's over. It's not even begun.
That's awesome.
But yeah, aside from playing, Call of Duty, and when you're young, you have a superficial affinity for the bad guys in the Hugo Boss uniforms. But I became overtly political by chance, really. It was a period in YouTube. I don't know if you'll remember this, but video games were all the rage, and the algorithm promoted this stuff like hell. And I was some adolescent watching this, and I saw this one YouTuber had channel recommendations, and in these channels there were ones I'd never heard of, and they happened to be The Amazing Atheist, Shoe on Head, Sargon, Undoomed, characters like that.
You got in through the skeptic community.
Oh, I absolutely devoured all of that. I mean, I watched everything they had, and it wasn't necessarily the atheism, but what spoke to me was this was around the time when feminism and Gamergate were going on, and these were things I was heavily invested in.
Another victim of Gamergate, yeah. There
are
dozens
absolutely.
of us.
But this. I was an avid gamer myself, and Anita Sarkeesian, all that. This got me into it, and eventually Trump was sort of this threshold where everyone picked their side on the issue. Some people like TJ fixated on Nazism being adjacent and all of that stuff, but I wasn't very much compelled by that. Then came along the Jordan Peterson guy, and I know this is going to get a lot of laughs of derision from the audience, but he really prepared me in the sense of he did biblical things with Genesis, and talking about the meta-truth in religion gave me a respect for it that I hadn't necessarily had before.
I think that's something that you can find with a lot of people, at least my age, because I do attribute some of that to Jordan Peterson as well, and I'm not afraid to name my past beliefs, right? And I don't think I should.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people like, it's fun to dunk on, Ben Sostein and what he's up to these days, but the works did touch something in a lot of young men that society hadn't provided them, and I think if you don't have to be grateful, but you have to acknowledge it.
I mean, I think people really underestimate how much of an impact it would have to tell someone of my generation just to clean your fucking room, that sort of thing. But I digress. There came a point in the COVID pandemic where I was finishing high school, and I committed myself to not just listen to people online, but to actually read. And I got through a breadth of topics, various writers. I went the whole political gambit: Marxism, Kropotkin, Solzhenitsyn, Dostoevsky, Evola before he was trendy, actually. And eventually I settled on Hop. But when I found Getting Libertarianism Right, he and Rothbard, I imbibed all of that. And I'll speak in more depth on that later, but they spoke and articulated things that Sal was saying in basic economics and abandoned the utilitarianism completely. They found this way to go from first principles to distribution chains, political economy, and these base instincts I had towards capitalism, one's people, order, these irreconcilable positions, they reconciled. So that absolute order from spontaneous order within capitalism was an instinctual young right-winger's dream. It was then that people like Academic Agent came into the picture, and around this time Trump was having things happen to him that YouTube finds disagreeable, and I won't mention any further. And remnants of that sphere in YouTube had previously been decimated by the algorithm, fractured into two camps. Before, it seemed like it was just two aspects of liberalism fighting it out, with the left pushing forward and the right essentially guffawing at them and talking about how silly it all is. At this point, people like AA, Scorp Monkey, Quinones, and others started talking about taking this initiative not just to react from one end of the liberal sphere, but sort of rediscover a genuine right-wing position. Spengler, Evola, Schmidt, Carlyle, people I had and hadn't encountered before, basically answered and delivered what people like Peterson had ironically now been priming people like me for. And I felt like this wasn't just an uneasy alliance I had with people like the skeptic community anymore, but something I genuinely believed wholeheartedly. And this was something that spoke and resonated to me in a way that nothing really had before. So I started getting more involved in places like basket weaving. I found the Beowulf Foundation and volunteer work through there. And eventually someone said, hey, why don't you write for Praxarchy? So that's what I decided to do. And now I'm here. So we'll see how this goes.
Very good. Someone in the comments named Kias said the blood sports era of YouTube is strangely absent in all origin stories. Do anyone here know what that is? The blood sports era of YouTube?
Yeah,
That was
so
back. Oh, so good.
yeah, blood sports was just this period where YouTubers, as far as I was aware, they'd get together, people who were diametrically opposed or not so opposed, and would fight it out
Oh, it's
metaphorically
all
in
the
the realms
debate
of the debate.
streams.
The debate me bro stuff, yeah. I
Okay,
mean,
yeah, with like what's his name, Destiny and stuff like that. Okay, yeah, no, that never interested me. I mean, that's why it's not part of my story, because I genuinely didn't really had no interest in watching those things.
Yeah, I feel like
I know
those people
Sargon
are
did a lot of
sorry.
it, but
Yeah,
oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry. I feel like those people have like a completely different pathway in terms of their approach and how they think about politics and so on. I follow the Crucible. I don't know if anybody else follows that channel on YouTube. That's Andrew Wilson. That's like one of these veterans who came in late into the blood sports era. But you have like a certain brand of right wing people. I think it's very attractive for certain like ortho bros and so on who will sit and do these debates and spurg out about theology. But it's a very different approach. I think if you are read on things like elite theory or focused on the things that we're focused on, like going into these debates with trannies is not really what you see as the solution in a sense. It's
Probably
just sort of
very
completely, yeah.
entertaining.
Oh, absolutely. Up to a point, of course. I feel like some of these debates, okay, we sort of hashed out all of the points and we're sort of at an impasse in terms of what you can actually get out of it. So they have to keep digging into more of these esoteric, weird subjects. And that's sort of where you see this these spaces go now. But again, very little constructive, in my opinion, is coming out of these debates, if anything at all.
Certainly.
I find we've kind of hit the end of the line on them. They're just sort of like, as you said, repeating themselves over and over again, and that just gets boring.
I mean, there were some good ones. I'm recalling I think it was the biggest live stream at the time, actually, but it was Andy Worski, Richard Spencer, Millennial Woes, I think, Sargon, and some other people who were intermediaries. And that was, I mean, to say that was the biggest live stream that YouTube had ever seen spoke to the fact that this must have had some impact. I'm not saying it was necessarily a good impact, but these people were around and they were big at one point.
Yeah. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about your article, and I'm going to bring that up on the screen, and then I think we're just going to have a bit of a read through, and we have some questions along the way. And I have a duplicate tab open. I don't want that. Let's see here. And there we go. So your article is called "A Rationalist's Argument for Irrationalism," and it features, a lot about Hoppe, but it also includes Yockey, Spengler, and a lot of the modern guys. And stop me if I'm wrong, but I'm getting the sense that this is a bit of an attempt to unify some of the ideas from Hoppe with the teachings that you talked about that you've been introduced to in the later years. Is that am I getting at something here?
I mean, it started out as that when I began writing it, but there came a point where I realized that there is an essential limit to the validity of Hoppe and what he can provide for us. I don't say that with any joy, particularly because he was a major influence on me, but there comes a point where his metaphysics, which I'm sure I'll get into more depth later, just can't be reconciled with the psychology of the West at the moment. And as an animating force, he's not something he's not got the efficacy we need.
No, I tend to agree, and it's hard to imagine there and some of the libertarian perspectives on this, given the reality we live in, and that's something that I brought up time and time again. Where in a perfect world, quote unquote, I would like to go hard on the anarcho-capitalism of someone like Hoppe, because of the spontaneous order and because of the self-segregation, etc., etc. But as long as we live in a world that will actively fight that, it doesn't seem that it has the tool to sort of wriggle itself out from under the oppressive boot of the GAE, right?
I mean, yeah, there is also the fact that when we talk about gaining power today, Hoppe might have imagined it as local organizing, which is not incommensurate with what we want. But the way he imagines it, it almost goes unnoticed, or there is a point where the gay just will not intervene for optical reasons, which I don't think will bear out in reality, particularly because we don't control the optics. The other thing is, if we're going the path of creating a network of tens being that sensible center that attracts rogue elites or potential rogue elites, then there are insights from Spengler, insights from Yockey, even insights from Schmidt that all seem to focus on this one point, which is he is talking about metaphysics. And that is a period of the West that has been and gone in terms of its power to compel people to action, particularly people who are that culture-bearing stratum. Sorry. And we're now in a period where socialism, not in the sense of how a leftist might define it, but in the sense that a Spenglerian might define it, as concern of economic and social policy and not metaphysics, first principles, but something grander, something more encompassing, occidental, that this individualist, not Christian, but still having some remnants of it. I don't think he's prepared for what will be needed in this hour of history, unfortunately.
Right. And you start off your article by writing a quote from Yockey saying, "Some men have been rational for short periods. This is the sum total of the appearance of reason in history, but they have never made history as it is irrational." So I think I'm just going to read, and any of you guys can stop me when you feel that it's necessary, and ask questions or comments, and then we'll just get going. "I don't believe that I am the first young man to become enraptured by the ideas of libertarianism. In a world where managerialism and bureaucracy run rampant, attempts at boycotting and protesting are ineffective against the statist Leviathan and its tendrils of market manipulation, BlackRock and Vanguard. Moreover, the evident shift in the culture is a symptom of this societal affliction. Through means such as ESG, these government proxies can alter the fabric of everyday life, thought processes, and morals of the masses through the force of armed monopolies, leaving its right-wing cultural and economic opposition with little recourse to fight within the regime. Libertarianism, to this young man discovering a means through which to channel his innate convictions and belief into practical action, became an obvious vehicle to manifest the restoration of the traditional order I wish to live in." That is...
It's interesting because I feel like I went on a very similar path in this regard as Carl. So it's I can almost see myself going through what he's going through here.
Well, the line that I always liked, which I think is unfair, but it's a good soundbite, is the idea of, is the one I stole from one of the, I think it's, what's his name? A Conscious Caracal or something, which is the idea that libertarianism is the equal of feminism for men, where it's this sort of total male brain. If I can just, put all of this into a neat system that is has these ideological first principles, everything is just going to work itself out and it's going to be great. But it doesn't really map to reality where women and feminine men live.
Yeah, I agree.
And yeah, I don't know. I don't think we have anything more to say here. I think we can all, I mean, a lot of us can probably recognize ourselves in this. So I'll just keep going. "I did not break into libertarianism through what many in this sphere would typically classify under the euphemism lolbertarians, but the fringe. Writers such as Hermann Hoppe kept the flame of paleo-libertarianism alive that his master Rothbard had lit in the 70s. Those amongst you familiar with these figures will realize that they differ distinctly from the typical GOP candidate or Rand Paul archetype, notably in that they were unshakable in their convictions and advocated openly for radical systemic change, not reform, in their approach. As opposed to the typical libertarian of 2008, Hoppe and Rothbard's thought did not relegate themselves to ensuring any and all drugs were as legal as possible. Legal as possible as soon as possible, with a tokenistic nod to gun rights, but through masterful treaties and some of the most consistent and cogent logical arguments that even today are of a quality I've rarely seen replicated, sought to use the very precepts of libertarianism against the hordes of degenerates who had since taken up its banner. The logic was deceptively simple. From the first principles, rational individualism, voluntary exchange, and subjective theory of value, one could easily carry the logic forward into systemic analysis of the hypothetical anarcho-capitalistic system. This is where the paleo and paleo-libertarianism entered the picture. The outcome was clear. There were winners and losers in this world of spontaneous order. With time being a finite resource one had to manage, those with the lowest time preference would therefore be the most successful. Following the axiom, the longer one is to delay gratification, the greater the rewards will be. Ergo, those such as drug addicts, homosexuals who have never had to raise a child, along with other corollary genetic factors, and those of different races would have different behavioral tendencies on average. From this, it is easy to see and justify a hierarchy akin to the Western governments of yesteryear, taking the individualist right to property as first principle. One reaches the point that one should not be free to associate and therefore free to disassociate. Rothbard, 2014. The forced integration of the melting pot had a right-wing response. Covenant communities were the answer. The explicit elite theory influence on this theory of how covenant communities would be governed satiated the requirement for order. The theory of subjectivity easily dismissed any question of necessary roads and polemics against government monopoly, and de facto socialism assured the reader that private initiative can do it better. I still believe this. And I do agree. I think that's the annoying part of it, and that in a lot of the theory and a lot of the economics I've seen from the Austrian school, it's hard to disagree with it, right?
Yeah, the Miesian argument, it's pretty solid. So I haven't seen anyone really destroy it. What's that? The calculation problem?
The economic calculation problem. I think
yeah.
This is our typical. I mean, but I think this is from Hayek, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just from the Mises people. So, but yeah, I mean, of course, if you argue from first principles, I mean, if you agree with the principles, if you've said A, you have to say B, and then you have to say C. It's
exactly.
So it's all perfectly logically contained in and of itself. The problem is when the mess of the real world comes in, and you end up with like these sort of edge cases.
Well, not just that. I mean, if you're, we're 20 minutes in and I'm about to pull in, Jonathan Haidt's. I mean, the value stuff. If your values are totally different from those first principles, you're going to say that, a hierarchy forming is the worst thing that could ever happen. We have to do everything in our power to stop a hierarchy from forming. I mean, obviously, this isn't going to make sense, right?
I mean, the other problem that I see with it is it's completely rational, and all of these things in some sort of algorithmic system that you could create on a computer would work exactly as you'd want it to. However, these people aren't just going to go away that you wouldn't want in your community. They're not just going to disappear and slowly starve outside of the gates, and you could just shoot whichever straggler decided to come by and try and, take a child or whatever. But the problem with it is that's not going to happen. And this isn't just going to prop up in Idaho and the government will just leave it alone because that's what it feels is morally right or is limited by the Constitution or something like that. And moreover...
And that's where we're back to sort of where I find a hard time with it. I don't see the arguments from libertarians providing a pathway to their, desired outcome. Now, I'm not saying that I have all the answers either, or that there aren't libertarians trying. There certainly are. But I'm having a hard time seeing, as I said, how they're going to manage to sort of get out from under the oppressive boot, right?
Well, there's only one way out.
I mean, it's the case of there is only one way out, yes, but there are other attempts, like Free State New Hampshire,
Yeah.
which is currently trying to muster every libertarian it possibly could in the country and isolate them in this one area where they can concentrate their power and overthrow the local state government incrementally, as Hoppe does suggest, as a path to power. To do it so incrementally that you get to a point where it's too late for the government to respond without using excessive force, and then the people will turn against them, and suddenly the libertarian utopia will arrive, and we'll all live happily ever after trading gold. It doesn't work like that. Propaganda is a powerful
as
tool.
grim as it sounds, you have to ask yourself the question: is the U.S. government willing to basically invade one of its own towns, call them all racists, and wipe them out? Right?
They've done it before.
I know. Yeah.
Ruby Ridge.
Yep.
And it won't be a case of entering their own town. It will be entering occupied territory that has been seized by terrorists of the state.
Yeah.
And this is the important part. It's the optics war. And we've seen in places like Georgia recently where they decide to get rid of NGOs, and suddenly you have, I'm borrowing this from Scrump and Evelyn, this sudden surge of democracy, this spontaneous democracy, where institutes and NGOs come along and decide that they're going to create a mob by telling them it's pro-Russian or it's terrorist or it's the Nazis or the Fourth Reich, Hitler's literally there, whatever they need to say. And they often achieve it, and people do believe it. So optically, it just won't happen if you're trying to do this grassroots subversion of the state. You'd need someone on the inside, and libertarianism doesn't really provide that.
Yeah, and the way I see it, it's all really sort of an appeal to whether you would say as first principles or metaphysics or whatever. I mean, you're just kind of relying on the fact that the people you're trying to convince believe the same type of metaphysic that you do. And if they don't, then okay, well, what then? You can keep trying to convince them until you're blue in the face.
Yeah, just because you're right doesn't mean you get to be king, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just because you have the best argument doesn't mean you win. Just because you think you have the truth on your side, it doesn't guarantee you anything. So there you go.
And this is why in political power, the first principle is very simple. It's just victory. That's not saying much, but it says a lot.
Fair enough. I wanted to talk about something else, but I think it's going to derail the conversation, so I'll save this for later. I think I'm just going to keep on reading. The failings of Hoppe. Where then is the problem? The logic is sound, the outcomes are amenable to those of the dissident right disposition, and the spontaneous order has a very strong emphasis on the order. The problem is its metaphysics. The problem is the disease of rationalism. Despite the hypothetical virtues of the Hoppian system, it is tainted with the Enlightenment and cannot stand up against the prevailing spirit of the age. In a previous era, Hoppe's theories might have gained greater traction, using metaphysics and reasons to conquer one's enemies such as Hobbes, Locke, and Filmer. Yet the age that superseded it was one of empiricism and scientific rigor, which again never defeated its enemies in the realms of the debate, but were simply acting in accordance with the power dynamics of the time and the spirit of the age. The world does not belong to you because you gave the best argument in a high school debate setting, and even more importantly, at no point in history was that ever the arrangement. Power is the deciding factor, and that is won through its ability to capture the minds of those important culture-bearing stratums of a particular age who can enforce its hegemony. Debate club might have been the sense one gets when imagining William Wilberforce delivering powerful anti-slavery tracts to Parliament with reason prevailing triumphantly, and the reason might have had a good bit to do with it. However, it should not be mistaken as winning through argument. The system in which the debate was facilitated decided the argument and set the trajectory. Had Wilberforce been born 100 years later, as empiricism took the place of metaphysics and further eroded Christianity, Wilberforce may well have been making economic utilitarian arguments to Parliament as to the emancipation of the slaves. It is telling that the vestiges of still living Marxist professors maintain that Wilberforce was purely motivated by economic factors. Anyone want to speak to this passage?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's multiple things to grab onto here. I mean, one of them is the you talk about like the influence of the Enlightenment, which is a sort of very nebulous thing when we discuss it in these spheres, where everybody has their own definition of what the Enlightenment is and so on. But the other thing is the remembering the connection between ideology and power. Now, if you're paying attention to the academic agent, he's been hammering on this idea of that ideology is basically just ad hoc justifications for power, which I'm not sure I agree 100%, but there is something there in terms of you have to remember that there always has to be a relationship between the power and the ideology. And in terms of libertarianism, there seems to be ideology or thought systems, but there's no power connected to them. There's no sort of ad hoc justification there. It's just like, okay, here are all these templates and all these rules that you could probably use at some point, but what does it matter? I mean, if there's no like real power center that it's attached to, and it's not really justifying anything other than like the sort of wishful thinking of people who wish they'd had power. So
it's not self-justifying, right?
No, not in the same way.
Yeah.
I kind of look at it like, even within the libertarian frame, is that your sort of ideas and ideology sort of reflect your own group, so and not other groups. So if you can maybe maintain a system of ideology within your own group, but as soon as you start bringing other groups in, then you have that conflict. So I think ideology can exist, but it's sort of like a fleeting, temporary thing within your own personal society, in a sense.
I mean, when I was writing it, I was trying to convey that there are cycles in which ideas and where those ideas can go, these sort of spirits of an age, they have their time and then they are displaced by the next spirit. It's a very cyclical conception of history. I note that later. But the other thing I wanted to get at just on this subject while we're at it is a lot of people accuse the left of not having principles. And they do have principles in the same that we do. But everyone is functionally a moral particularist. They have their in-group and they will treat their in-group a certain way, which is very amenable, very honorable, very generous in how they treat their friends. But they will treat their enemies in a completely different way. And I'll get onto that later. But when you're going for power, you have to assume this sort of doublethink where you have these innate instincts. You know you should be in charge because you know you should be in charge. It's not something you can be reasoned out of. You are a person, you have a disposition. It can be biological, spiritual, whatever. But you know there is a way that the world should be. And you have friends and enemies, and this manifests into a political where it's a struggle to make that world realized. And these are the sorts of things we have to consider when we're talking about rationalism and this perfect metaphysic and always having to not use government power because what if it was one day used against us as the guns pointed against our head? These things have to be overcome in a certain way, and the principle we have to adhere to is us. We are the principle. It is our team, and that should be the consideration above all else, I think, when going forward.
Yes, it's important to be pro-friend and anti-enemy.
Yeah, I think that's been hammered in extremely well. I mean, there's been some new, information or some new reads. I mean, on the Praxarchy, we had Nathan Hood. I think he's in the comment section as well. Release a piece on the politics of chimpanzees, like based on Frans de Waal's book, Chimpanzee Politics, where he's making the distinction between the friend and enemy and rivals, essentially, that you could have rival relationships inside of a sort of in-group, and then you have the friend and enemy distinction that's really between the in-group and the out-group. That's been one lens that I've been looking at things recently, and it's also, we talked about loyalty, Walrus, in a private conversation recently, where you showed me a video of a guy who talked about, that some people have loyalty as a very high value. If you look at the Jonathan Haidt's moral matrix, that's one of the 5 values in his moral matrix, where typically conservatives are going to score a lot higher in things like loyalty, meaning basically that you will go to institutions or leaders or people in your community, and you will just follow them and trust that they're going to make the best decisions for you. And like Trump said, I could go out in the streets of New York and just shoot somebody and it wouldn't change anything, because he has a lot of those people, I think, that are high in loyalty, that have been convinced that he's on their side, and they're just going to follow him to the end of the earth, pronto. So in terms of like the leftists and the leftist principles, I think the left has loyalty, but they're much more about purity testing people in terms of having the right values. That's where you get this sort of, say their names, trans rights. Like, if you want to go up in the leftist ranks, you have to just have certain beliefs. They will just keep, boot checking you.
It's something I
for every
found,
person,
to be honest, with what people would call the lolbertarians in real life, that, instead of doing politics, they're more interested in just, purity spiraling about who can be the most libertarian.
Yeah, so I guess that's another type of personality configuration that are probably a lot more about, particular principles and so on. Let's see. I think I got a little bit lost here.
Sorry, you were talking
these
about
topics.
leftists and loyalty.
It's the idea that I do really think that, like, leftists have principles, and they're just retarded principles. It's just incredibly stupid type of ideas that they have to kind of enforce hegemonically across, because they're not, they will kick people to the curb who are, say, like with Chris Cuomo or Andrew Cuomo. If some kind of like sex allegation comes up, they will just kick that guy to the curb immediately because he violated some of their, tenets, and they're kind of struggling to find people who are pure enough to kind of race in their ranks.
It's about the survival of the system, or the social, as you said, Carl, in the Spenglerian sense, above all else, right?
Well, yeah, and on the Cuomo thing, the issue I have with that is this man will have been around for a long time. He was a very prestigious character, and there seems to be these phases they go through where somebody becomes inconvenient, and Cuomo at the time was being particularly harsh to a certain community in New York during the COVID vaccines. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it was a certain. Yes. Well, we'll leave that to the canny
Swedish
members
immigrants.
of the audience. Yeah, yeah. Well, he this prestigious group he discriminated against, and he went up. He punched up, which he shouldn't have done. And I find it interesting that when it was specifically that act that occurred, suddenly these floodgates of allegations opened from 20 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that everyone was content to not talk about, including the victims themselves. I think that the friend-enemy distinction goes as far as, even when your friends do something that is entirely contrary to what you believe, you'll keep them around because they're useful. And when they violate the prime tenet, the one thing that actually binds you all together, which is the system of power and who's in charge and who's not, and maintaining that hierarchy, once you go against that, that's when these floodgates of allegations, real or fictitious, really start to emerge. And I think that's what happened with the Cuomo dynasty.
Because I saw a video of Chris Cuomo on Twitter recently with he's launching the initiatives like Democrats for Israel or something. He really had to crawl back to get back in the limelight. It's talking about that,
he's
how everybody needs to be.
He's never going to beat Israel's strongest soldiers, the Republican Party. I don't know why he would try.
But I mean, I don't want to derail completely, but you see similar things, like even in Norwegian politics, like inside of the Labour Party, where you had some of the people that are actually competent in leadership, like that one guy who was caught doing with the dancing video, because people thought that it looked rapey, and they just like the sort of fringe left just kind of turned on him, even though he is one of the most sort of competent leaders that they have.
I mean, there's a bit more of a story to that, because that's a long-standing feud within the Norwegian Labour Party that's been going on between various power centers, and it's going to a end. Maybe we'll have to do an old school episode at one point. And talk about that, because it's been movement in the Norwegian Labour Party lately that I find interesting, with a bit more of a sophisticated power analysis look.
Well, I just have one thing to say about this: how you see this conflict of elites that are supposedly allies and friends, and then they turn on each other. You find this a lot near the decadent parts of near the ends of empires, because when your civilization is really in a bad spot, the people will generally beg for the king, regardless of whether he's, or beg for leadership, regardless of whether he's like a nice leader or not. And you can see it now where, as you said, with the Norwegian guy dancing funny, and then they consider it rapey, and then you get the infighting. It's interesting because that happens everywhere now. Just another sign.
Well, I mean, in the fantastical solar world of someone like Julius Evola, as I've said at some point, the king is the king because he's the king. He doesn't really have to justify himself because the metaphysics of society are sort of the wind at his back. And he's either going to crush you or he's going to be defeated by a stronger force. So the sort of figuring out who to follow in that scenario is a lot easier than it is towards the decline, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'm going to keep reading. As Schmidt notes in Political Theology, it is a part of the sociology of the concept of sovereignty of that epoch to show that the historical political existence of the monarchy corresponded to the entire state of consciousness of Western European humanity at the time, and that the juristic shaping of historical political reality could find a concept whose structure corresponded to the structure of metaphysic concepts. It's a bit of a mouthful, this passage, but I think it's easy to think about it in this sense, and that is that after the invention of the computer, the way that humans start to look at things are often through the lens of a computer. So we have a tendency to view things through the lens or through the... do you use that in this article? You talk about the fishbowl, Carl?
No, I didn't, and I just
okay. I read someone. I think I was reading a piece from Academic Age, and he uses that a sort of he calls it the waters that we swim in, and it's hard to look outside of that, and that goes for more than just politics. So I'm going to keep reading. For us, this is an important lesson. Many of us are the products of yesterday's intellectual lineage and are no longer capable of fully capturing the culture spirit of modern man, and the sociology of sovereignty has not been sufficiently answered within Hoppianism. The sociology of sovereignty has elucidated that metaphysical liberty has long been superseded by democracy, which has since been subverted by technocracy. Within this article, I have embedded the terminology of Spenglerian thinkers, and this is no accident. Within Spengler and Yockey's text are the refutation of libertarian metaphysics in the sense of something objective and eternal. Any comments, or should I keep going?
Well, I just wanted to go back to the previous paragraph before that. I was going to say, when you were talking about seeing things through a computer, because we now live in a technological age, Spengler writes a lot about, now that we're entering this age where everything is monetary and economic, we're reduced to this point where we can only see these things in those terms. And a lot of the dissident right, as I would see it, is something that's concerned a lot with quality, the substance, the parochial, things that can't really be defined on a scoreboard or some sort of tabulation.
The reign of quantity, as Grenon called it.
Yeah, exactly. So when we have a lot of issues now, it's a struggle to see if the gay could actually even understand what we were talking about. I mean, when we're talking about immigration and the quality and the culture of people who are there, they see those as irrelevant. I do think there is a sect within the elites that do genuinely believe that we could reduce people to this atomless mass, because it would be, a culturalist mass, an atomized mass.
That every human is basically interchangeable with the next.
Yeah, it's an economic unit to them, and that's all it is. They don't realize their own malevolence in a way, because this is just the spirit of the age which they're born in. We only think about things in terms of social and economic policy for the way the state runs, for the sake of the state running. And in a way, it's devoid of metaphysic.
Yeah, there is that sort of materialistic element, like 2,000 calories a day is what you need a worker to make 30 widgets. And then, so you start calculating the person's value in those widgets and minus the calories, right? It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, certainly. Let me just check my notes here. If we've, no, I think we should keep going. We can save one of those questions for later. Let me see. What did I miss? So this one and this one here. In Imperium, he explains, the new theory of history broke down the old linear scheme. The new outlook became a sole necessity of Western civilization at the same time that the history-seeking activity did, even though it was to remain half-articulate until the First World War. This intense outburst of probing the past was an expression of the super-personal feeling that the riddle of history was not touched with the old linear device, that it had to be unlocked, and that the totality of facts must be surveyed. As the new facts accumulated, the higher-ranking historians took a wider view, but not until the latter part of the 19th century did any historian or philosopher actually treat cultures as separate organisms with parallel existence, independence, and spiritual equality. The theory of history that Spengler proposes is not linear or accidental, although surely on the upswing assumedly when the anarcho-capitalists assume power, but cyclical and, as importantly, psychological. The spirit of a people is characterized by innate emotions and feelings which people use as a lens for understanding the world. It is a simple fact, to invert the famous phrase, that feelings do not care about your facts. Just as with previous ages, we will now be unable to recognize previous epochs of history without this framework of understanding. The problem then with Hoppianism is to try and create an ideology amenable to our ambitions using the defunct rules and laws of a previous age. This will be understood by most as hermeneutics. Is that how you say it out loud? By the way,
I think it's the hermeneutics.
in English?
Hermeneutics.
Sorry, what? Hermeneutics.
Hermeneutics.
Okay. In Hoppe's view on hermeneutics, he states, would it not seem appropriate to ask, what then about their own pronouncements? If there is nothing like truth based on common objective ground, then all of the preceding talk surely cannot claim to say anything true. In fact, it would be self-defeating to do what they seem to be doing, denying that an objective case can be made for any statement, while at the same time claiming this to be the case for their own views. I'm going to keep going, all right? Whilst Hoppe makes the statement that, on the face of it, seems inscrutable, it does not understand that the perception of these facts is confined to one's culture, soul, and genetics. He's not, unlike most modern intellectuals, afraid of such topics. He embraces them and finds these dispositions and inherent differences between peoples one of the core components as to why a society would self-segregate and maintain its cultures in a system. If there is, then, an irrationalist objective truth, would one then see an aggregate trend towards one people, culture, and faith? Hoppe gives a tacit affirmative in praising Protestantism and the white culture soul. He also recognizes that cultures are, in aggregate, incommunicable, and deterministic, as well as with differences in individuals. How then, and I think this is where it gets good, how then can an African culture soul ever recognize and see the value in our conventions, cultures, behaviors, theology, and political systems? When an attempt is made to adopt the white culture soul, the subconscious assessment and comprehension from those indigenous to other culture souls interprets and morphs it into something more amenable to their spirit. One can identify this all across the Western world, and has been described by many as a word. It has been responsible for the rise in cultural entities such as the Dino. And this is in the UK, right? What is the difference between like a Dino and a chav? Because that's a word I've heard too. You're going to have to enlighten us.
A chav is
it just white trash?
Yeah, essentially.
Council housed and violent.
Okay, and the Dino is what?
Sort of more middle class, materialistic, living off credit, doesn't really have any political innate feelings one way or the other.
Presence, listening to rap music, etc. Is that it?
Not so much. More like really just Imagine an average person devoid of any opinion whatsoever, and just
Okay.
living life like that. Not living life in a bad way. We wouldn't be satisfied with it, but sort of reign of quantity writ
I
large.
see. Okay. Yeah. The change in cultural music tastes, the change in beauty standards, and the alteration from individualism towards a greater group consciousness. If I do remember, I think from all of this, the thing you're going to get most pushback on would probably be the beauty standards question, because I've seen a lot of people lately on the right online argue for. I think we can all agree that a lot of the modern or the current mainstream media pushes the I can't Fed post here. Let me the the women with a lot of junk in the trunk. Let's put it like that.
I believe
And
the term we've settled on is Lizification in that sense.
Lissofication. Let's say that, yes. That the Lissofication of beauty standards is not actually a different culture soul or a biospirit. It is totally within the white man's culture soul to be attracted to the
Tell
Lisso.
you what, all I have to say on that is let's not hasten the day. All right, let's
Yeah.
leave it at that.
I'm uh, I'm sort of joking with you here. I think you're saying a lot more important things than I don't want to get bogged down in talking about that stuff. Okay, I'm gonna continue. Ba, 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 ba. Individuals with greater consciousness. All right. This has largely left those indigenous to the African culture soul ascendant, and those of the European culture soul have been left floundering in nihilism. Papa accepts implicitly that this system will work for whites, understands the differences in culture, and the determinants such as evolutionary psychology, but he does not make the leap to suggest that another culture soul can never understand the internal machinations of another, let alone subconsciously adopt it as their own. In this sense, an objective truth beyond human understanding may not be relative, but is most definitely irrelevant and of no use to actual civilizations. This is not to say that purely through the power of voodoo, witch doctors, and hunter gatherer societies one is capable of getting a culture to the moon, but it uniquely resonates with their inner being, spirit, or evolutionary psychology, if you prefer, and will never understand the culture of the other, respectively, as we are inhabiting an entirely different world to our own culture zone. It is then with some irony that the rationalist line of thinking that presupposes an objective truth in those terms is morally particular to the West and will never be communicable from it. Even then, the West has long passed the stage of its cycle where it had such explanatory power, and the theology, the articles of belief on which the West stands, are now hermeneutic. And I think I have a follow-up question if you have anything you want to say here. But for anyone can jump in here. I have to just take care of something real quick.
Well, imagine 200,000 years of human evolution, much of that apart, say like 40,000 years, depending on the culture, and thinking that that has had no effect on the development. It would just be crazy. So
I mean, exactly. Yeah, that is what I'm getting at from the evolutionary perspective. But I also wanted to emphasize the other aspect of this, which is the sort of spiritual, more nebulous aspects. People call it biospirit. I'm fine with that term. That I'm not saying that we have this perfect grasp and understanding as, the Uber Chad Nordic Aryan spirit. What I am saying is we've got a set of tools at our disposal in how we understand the world, and that will manifest in certain ways with certain cultures, with certain civilizations, if they get that far. We are the only civilization that really cared about time, past, present, and future. And Spengler takes note of this. We're the ones who were fixated with clocks. We're the ones who were fixated with dates and chronology. When we think of other civilizations, historians have noted that they seem to omit everything that was probably worth keeping in and keep all the details that were best to omit. And that tells you just the disparity between how we understand civilization and what we think is important versus others. And these two things just are incommensurate. So going forward, it's a case of this can't be communicable, and we have to accept that we're, in a sense, just as irrational as anyone else, but we have our own spirit, and it can't be taken from us, and we can't impose it on anyone else.
What are your thoughts on, so like, I assume you understand the Faustian spirit, which is like endless space or expansion in endless space. Then you have the Magian, which is sort of timelessness. How do you explain the boomers? I have this idea that they're sort of like the endless cruise.
The endless cruise. They're just going to be sent off to the. It's like when the joke of sort of when a parent tells their kid that their pet has gone to the farm to live with all the other animals. It's just no, I'm just gonna be on a cruise forever.
Well, they have this thing now. They have this thing. I think it's like Norwegian Cruise Lines or something. But you can go all around the world all year, and it's like 40 grand. And some boomers, they talk to me. They're like, "This is like their dream, just cruising all the time," While civilization collapses around them.
I mean, it is a sort of perversion of the Faustian spirit, in the sense, for the boomers, that is, in the sense that we've got this generation of people who think they can just tax and spend and go on credit. And if we get the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve involved enough, and they can just take from the future as much as humanly possible, they can satiate their needs from now until the moment they leave this earth. And, when actually reading Faust, that's essentially the story, that you're given this, basically what seems like power that can't be contained or conceived of its limits. And eventually the devil comes to collect his due, and I could think of no better allegory than that for the boomers.
Well, it's like boomers are on a treadmill of expansion into infinite space, compared to everything else.
Yeah, in that sense, the boomers are probably more Faustian than the millennials and the Zoomers. At least it's a very good point. They really don't believe that they're constrained in any way. So, I mean, my general comments to this, especially with the concept of like the biospirit or the culture soul, it is like a sort of recurring thing that's always been a bit of a headache when you're dealing with larger type of right-wing communities, because you have the whether it would be like the libertarian metaphysic, or you have like sort of the Christian metaphysic, or people who have beliefs rooted in some kind of absolutism, where it really is about like there's this objective truth that should at least be able to apply across borders, and the world would be better if these objective rules were enforced, and if everybody could agree on this thing, or if they don't agree on them, they should be made to agree. Where on the other side is like, okay, like there are such deep, almost metaphysical, again, differences between different peoples and how they just perceive and exist in the world. So like, what is actually enlightened here? Is it to kind of accept and dive into, just roll into the kind of subjectivism, or do you go with the more objective approach? I mean, it's not always very straightforward. I mean, you're seeing it with political parties. Even in some sense, we talked about the woke. I feel like the being woke is really just kind of being aware of like how various people are different in a completely different way than we are. But I feel like they're also quite in the game of trying to think about how like black people have different needs than white people, and Asians are different than blacks, and so on. I mean, so I mean, in some sense, that's why I sort of think that like the regular kind of the standard Democrat line is almost a little bit more well thought out than the Republican one. Yeah, we agree. Still agree.
I mean, to be anti-woke is in many ways worse than being woke. Because at least when you're woke, as you said, you're at least aware.
I mean, I think that a funny way to characterize ourselves might be, that we've got the dark enlightenment. We might almost classify ourselves as the dark woke, because we approach a lot of these things in the same
That's
way.
pretty good.
It's getting into, we're getting too deep into the definitions here.
That's lining up with a lot of AA stuff with the Emperor.
I'm just a poor little hobbit. Okay. I think I'm going to keep on reading, and then we have a couple of questions that we have lined up for you, Carl. If not rationalism, then what? A doctrine does not attack and affect the life of the period in its innermost depths. If not a doctrine, and it better not be taught. Spengler. I was born into a generation that maintained the trappings of empiricism. I was brought up to think critically and scrutinize every claim made so that the debate could bring society collectively closer to the truth. Through this, I found the metaphysics of rationalism and paleo-libertarianism. However, that was not what convinced me or my fellow contemporaries who joined me on that intellectual journey. As Hoppe states in the blurb of his most famous work, Democracy, the God That Failed, he makes the argument on utilitarian grounds. This means of compelling an audience to abandon utilitarianism for liberty is not only deeply ironic, but indicative of the age. An immutable base level of our understanding must always be spoken in the language of the age we live in. Our age happens to be technological, theology of finding the most efficient means to perpetuate a system with no underlying reason as to why it should continue in the first place. As I stated earlier in this article, the seduction of Hoppe was taking one's disposition towards capitalism and one's people and synthesizing it through metaphysics. His appeal was never liberty in itself, but how liberty could further our unarticulated and transcendental and subjective aims. It was for Rothbard a form of ethics that would be followed and built upon by society for its own whims, but they certainly had an outcome they predicted. In Ancapistan, the anarcho-communist could never win, nor could the neocon, nor any other character trying to forge his community no matter the force of his argument. Great care is spent dictating and refining the perfect system of retribution for government officials and law enforcement post-revolution, yet the ANCAP society would not punish anyone who was to overstep and begin shooting them. They would make the exception. Moreover, if a communist is shot in his own home by a citizen, then jurisprudence would likely fall in his favor. The theology of any system makes its miracles in order to sustain itself. To the man of the moment, these presuppositions on the relationship between politics and power need no justification and are self-evident. Moreover, the psychology of the masses is entirely unsuited to the yesteryear's rationalism anyway. They were always emotive and malleable creatures, but they are now even more conscious of it than before. For these reasons, Hoppe's rationalism is destined to fail. I'm going to keep reading. All right. No comments. With this perspective and knowledge of power relations dominating the coming age, it is impossible to return to an earnest rationalist approach to any ideology. We have our beliefs, convictions, and morality, but also the consciousness that they mean nothing unless we can take the system for ourselves. If we no longer look to Locke, Jefferson, Hoppe, and Rothbard for our answers, we must find them in those who write for this age, such as Spengler, Evola, Francis, and Schmidt. All of these men have been given new life by Providence at this moment in history, and I believe that this is no accident. For the past 100 years, these men have acted as those initial culture bearers of the becoming against the being. The being is the cycle of the organism we are now in, and they were the advocates for the next stage of becoming whilst it was in its infancy. The psychological age is now at the gates of the old, and the vessels for this culture soul will inevitably be found to fulfill the promise of history. The becoming will prevail. Each epoch has its faith that underpins its belief. We have seen outright theology, metaphysics, materialism, progress, and finally postmodernism. I think it's interesting that you say that because I've felt that myself in many of the things that someone like Evola writes, and especially in some of his later works, obviously, that he writes for a future almost in a way that he knows is going to need him more than he's writing for, his actual current age.
Reminds me of those memes where it says, I'm fighting for a future I'm not sure even exists.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, yeah, Carlyle had the same tendency. I think he often said he was writing for not the man now, but 200 years from now, where all his prophecies would essentially come to fruition, which they did. And unfortunately, that was about when he went out of print. So Unfortunate for him.
Yes. The fact that I'm writing this and you're reading it gives enough credit to this claim, at least for us. This is the final hurdle to be overcome in terms of faith. We are born children of the last faith as it becomes disillusioned. There was a fight before us over this faith that was lost, as Napoleon before us failed on the field of battle. However, an idea cannot be stopped when its time has come. The moral particularism we're now ascribing to is necessarily half-hearted. As those of a different spirit in our youth, it is difficult to place one's complete faith in anything. Nihilism has been bred into us. Materialism is given credence. A study promoting our viewpoint still generates self-satisfaction, and although we know the rates at which items for both sides are forged, the disputations as to the empirical validity are the first recourse when tackling an opposing study, and never our own. For us, it is time to recognize we are what we are. We have a culture soul and a being that is right simply because it is ours. We cannot justify our view to other culture souls, and we cannot be convinced away from ours by theirs. To shed the desire to argue and debate is something anathema to the era we are leaving, but it's natural to the next. Those such as Evola, who speak of a solar Nordic race of men that are destined to come after the Kali Yuga, who defy all laws of science and can use magic, is something we cannot conceive of, let alone try to attain. Yet we must believe it. You can use the evolutionary psychology argument, which has proponents such as Edward Dutton, to justify bringing back this high group preference. Or you can use the works of Filmer to justify why one must be sovereign, to satiate that inherent need to materially or rationalistically prove something. Whatever is necessary for you to be personally convinced is perfectly acceptable. A critical test of power is whether it can not only suffer its contradictions, but wear them brazenly. Remember always that it is beyond question that we are correct because we are. We are of the right, and the left is inherently wrong because it is not us. We want to rule because it is just that we do. We are the only ones fit to rule because we are right. Any further elaboration of these claims is not only unnecessary but counterproductive. If in this pivotal hour we do what is demanded of us, then our future generations won't have to bear the cross of contradiction at all. For them, the moral self-assuredness we aspire to will be as intuitive and subconscious as breathing. For those unfortunate enough to be born into this interbellum period, or as you would put it, Liquid Swan, the interregnum, the only rational recourse you have is to be irrational. Very good article. Any last comments, Luddic Path, Liquid Swan, and of course,
I think it's beautifully written. Happy to have Carl around. Like, looking forward to future articles for sure.
Yeah, no, it's the phrase that everybody hates. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, there's a lot to think about in these paragraphs. And it's heavy stuff for sure. So, but yeah, I just echo the sentiments of Liquid Swan. I really appreciate having Carl Hermann Habermas on the team. So, looking forward to more stuff. I don't know, Carl, if you want to elaborate some on the last paragraph.
Yeah, so the thing that I've been trying to hammer through the entire article is that we can't be rationalist anymore. It's not suited to who we are. It was not suited to this age. And we are having to essentially justify ourselves now in a period where everything has just been functioning in the way it has because it had no justification other than it exists and it should keep going. And we have to essentially adopt that for ourselves in our beliefs and our values. There is no question when talking to someone who represents the regime that the GDP must go up because the GDP must go up because the GDP must go up, and that immigration is right and moral, and that we must essentially just carry on the way we are doing things because it's inevitable. That's what is happening. This is, one of Tony Blair's tricks where the conversation is over. It has been settled, and now we are just going to do it. We need to advance the dialectic in our direction, not because it's rational or because it has to be justified, but because this is what we believe. We can't not believe it. And that is both of it is both a survival imperative that we think this, and it's just natural to us at this point in our cycle. And now we've got to do essentially, Roger Crooks just said, the left always dissect these norms. The left is dissecting what came before, and the cleverer ones who have been facilitated to do that are through people like Tony Blair, are through the fact that the wars were essentially won and the will was imposed, like at Nuremberg, things like that. That's why this has been allowed. We now need to essentially start acting in that way for ourselves. We don't have the force of arms, but what we do have is the ability to push the dialectic one way or the other, and building this elite on these foundational principles of we are right because we are right is what we need to do in the future and what we should pursue. And that's how I'd end it off, to summarize.
Path, we have collected a couple of questions, and I mean, I suppose we can just post them for the entire panel. Do you want to read them out, or should I?
Yeah, I don't know which ones that we think have been covered already, but say those are not related to like your red pilling story and yourself, because you've already introduced yourself. So first question then would be, what are the strengths of the Hoppian ANCAP system?
I mean,
or at least sort of in the current year. That's the question. What do you think? Like, do you think there's anything salvageable in the Hoppian system currently?
I mean, like I said in the article, I do still believe a lot of the precepts that Hoppe sets down, and I think that they have explanatory power to the extent that between us talking not to the masses, it can elucidate a lot of things that we could then condense in another format and use as praxis, or if we wanted and felt it necessary, disseminate to the masses. Things like bio-Leninism, he talks about that essentially in terms of who's going to win, why. I don't know if I can say this on YouTube, but tell you what, we'll ignore that one. And he does have nascent aspects of elite theory that could be useful. There's a lot of intersection with neo-reactionary thought, and that's why I found when a long time ago now, people like Charlemagne and Settlers and Men were first coming on Academic Agent, I found a lot of convergence in my thought and theirs. When he talks about the way he imagined the Covenant communities running are essentially like small monarchies, where a family that is trusted not only for its competence and its biological pedigree, but because people are generally masses and act as masses do, which is subservient and going along with what they're told to do. So these things are things we can understand, and particularly with things like SFB, which is current week, not current year, having banks collapse and a system through which we can understand the economy, which is generally functional and essentially correct, is a way that we can win rogue elites over. And it can also, if it's correct, we have an angle of attack essentially where there's a weakness in what the regime does. And if you impose Frederick List over that, it's basically an ideal regime for preserving power. So there are aspects that are salvageable, but in its totality, I don't think it's suited in a meta-analysis sense of how history functions and works and how we should conceive of it generally. So it depends your level of assessment of the thing. But I would say this article is, in another sense, a sort of funeral oration for Hoppe in my own mind, and moving away from rationalism entirely to this sort of new idea and new conception that I think is necessary now. So that would be my assessment of him.
Yes, just as a follow-up question, you don't think there's anything that can be salvaged from, say, from the anarcho-capitalist canon as kind of like post hoc rationalizations for power, in a sense, because that's what I've been thinking about. I mean, at certain points, you're going to need, the bullshit, like Walrus talked about in the article.
Yes, well,
to justify power.
I mean, as in previous ages, when William Wilberforce is talking about metaphysics and Locke is talking about metaphysics and first principles to justify his position, there is this nascent and trace remnant of Christianity underpinning the whole thing. But that is very much the background as opposed to the foreground at this point. And with Hop, it will be the same thing, where it might be, if you dug into it a little bit, we could say, oh, first principles, right to property. Even I thought we lived in a democracy. It didn't have to be necessarily from the anarcho-capitalists. And it's a wellspring of bullshit in that sense. But I don't think it captures what will really animate people, which is in the modern age. And it's been used to great effect by people like Black Lives Matter, the critical race theorists, that we are essentially this thing which in itself has value. We don't have to justify it because we are Black or Asian or of another culture or another tribe. We inherently have value and deserve to exist and deserve to be given things and can fight for ourselves. And we are the only ones who are essentially been retarded in our philosophical progress by certain events of the 20th century, which is something we should be working to overturn. And I've wrote another article where we can't just march under the banner of the modern Satan, which is the mid-century Germans, but we can step over it and we can move into something that is essentially those beliefs and just shake. The aim is to just shake off like water off a duck's back, allegations of that sort, and just say, no, we are for ourselves now, and that is the end of it.
But I mean, even if you look at things like Black Lives Matter, there will be like mounds of college professors and academics and bureaucrats that, if you sat them down, they would sit and give you arguments for why what they're doing is justified, either from some like critical theory perspective, or they would go back to, the victim frame seems to be very powerful, I think, in the age that we live in, is that you have to, instead of appealing to the rationalism, you have to basically say that I'm hurt, right? I've been wounded in the past, and because I've been hurt, it's my right to hurt you back. Like the article you just wrote on reparations, I think that's the argument that they were using, is that say like in San Francisco in like the 1940s, there were restrictive covenants stopping Black people from owning property, and that's snowballed into them having no equity at this point and so on, and therefore they should get reparations. So I mean, there are arguments that they could make, right? So that's sort of the counterpoint that I'd make, is that it's very hard to just kind of like be the based Chad guy and just say, yes, I'm for myself, and not have any argument for it.
I mean, that's what we aspire to get to, though, that this is just accepted. And I should have clarified before, not so much that there will be no bullshit. There will definitely be bullshit, and it will be good, I promise. But the thing that I'm talking about is rationalism, metaphysics, Christianity even. These things are universal. They apply to everyone. It's fair, in a sense. This is a recognition that life is not fair, and we're out for me and mine, essentially.
I think
we will have justification for this.
Sorry. I think we should just say stuff like, I'm sorry you're weak. Well, I'm not sorry you're weak, so more accurately. And what's when the Athenians were in Miletos, and they said,
the weak,
the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must.
Yep.
The way I probably would imagine it going was, we conquered the world in self-defense like Rome did. We have the moral high ground. We are the victims and the victor.
Yes, I'm the victim of my own success. So basically, that's it's difficult. No, but I do think that there has to be a lot of work done with the ideology, and I mean, and that's sort of the weird kind of intersection, or the reason that you have like a kind of right wing with the universalists and the particularists. But the thing is that the universal standard that is being touted in the right wing could be interpreted as basically being a kind of parochial white standard, right? And if that universal standard is universally applied, being a white standard, it will then say put white people at an advantage. And that's something else to think about, is that, even though you have people who are like genuine believers in the fact that everybody could be equal in some kind of like Protestant Christian civilization, from a particularist perspective, this is a very kind of nice post hoc ideological explanation, right?
I mean, yeah, I would tend to agree. Sorry, there was something I was going to say there, but it got lost. It'll come back to me. Hold on.
Let me see here. I don't. Someone's talking about Sam Harris in the chat. Is Sam Harris doing
Oh
stuff
yes,
again? Is that it?
yes. He's talking about, because I was talking about moral particularism. Sam Harris had this quote where he was being interviewed by Spiked, I believe, and goes on to say that with the Hunter Biden allegations being thrust in front of him, that he would not care if there was a mound of children's corpses in Hunter Biden's basement.
Oh yeah, that one. Yep.
Anything to keep Trump out of office. And Luddick's thing just came back to me, where the one thing the left is good at is systemic analysis, and I think they're correct in this essentially, once you take into account that, there are deterministic factors, and they call it socioeconomic. We call it something different, but we'll leave it there. And with that in mind, whatever system you implement, moral particularism will become a universal in a sense. But if everyone becomes morally particularistic, which I think is coming, but a system is going to benefit, it will have its beneficiaries. And if this were to occur, we would be the beneficiaries. At the moment, it's the inverse. And I think Luddick's assessment in that sense is correct. And that's what we should be aiming for.
That kind of reminds me I think one of the main differences between like the left and the right now is that the right can deal with this thing called ceteris paribus, which I first heard when reading the Muses. And basically what it means is like, once you eliminate all their factors and they're just comparing two, what do you get out of that? And I think the left doesn't like to do that because it shows them a lot of information they don't like to see. So they can sort of obscure the truth and then keep their ideology pumping, which captures a lot of people.
I mean, it's obvious that our side is completely correct in everything and their side is completely incorrect in everything. And it's not coincidence that we happen to be on the side that is right. There is a sense, I'm trying to convey in there a sense of irony that it doesn't really matter. If it came out tomorrow that the left were right in all their assumptions and indisputable proof of this was thrust in front of us, I don't think that would change anyone's mind. I really don't, because everyone has a biological imperative, and they are wired certain ways, and they are optimized to survive in certain conditions. And autistic reasoning, above all else, is not something that is the norm for a reason. We are emotional creatures, we're tribal creatures, and this search for a sort of irrational transcendental value that says, God is the reason that we're here on this earth, and he's the reason that we are ordained to rule. That is inherent throughout everyone. There are probably aboriginals who think that they are the master race, and more power to them in that sense, because you're never not going to be like that as a people. It's just not possible. Even the leftists of today, the out-group preference types, have this sense, I think a lot of them, that they are the savior. They are imparting civilization onto these poor, weak, helpless people. And I think in a sense they embody that colonial Faustian tradition that we don't. We're almost Magian compared to them. And at that point, it's like, I don't think that truth matters. And I know that might be a tough pill to swallow.
It's easy to swallow when it's about the current year things going on the left, the sort of the weird woke stuff, right? Those are the easy pills to swallow when you say that the truth doesn't matter, but it's another thing to internalize that it works the other way as well. To say that, we have to believe it too, but we just have to, believe our story more than they believe theirs, pretty much.
Well, to be honest, I mean, getting older, I've sort of gotten more to the point where you end up in a sort of centrist position because there are certain things that seem to be, universal, not in terms of, let's say, like the universal moral, metaphysical truth, but in terms of, let's say, like the operations, like we looked at James Burnham's The Machiavellians. If you look at the operations of organizations, for example, or how certain size organizations have to operate just by mechanical necessity, it seems to be quite universal. Or how relationships between hierarchies have to operate. It's certain technical mechanical universality to it that really, I mean, I feel like that's kind of the problem with, the wokies. And the reason that people like Tony Blair try to put the wokies away, because they interfere at some level with the actual practical operations with how things are supposed to function. Like they on some level, because they're so into like just creating their own truth, they interfere with effective governance, right? And I feel like we have to be able to do that instead of just kind of doubling down on, I'm the warrior of my own universe, dreamscape or whatever on our side. So I just feel like it's a little bit of pushback there, because I see that with some of the like the Hyperborean crowd, and it's kind of like Sumer Hyperborean chat room. So it's really kind of my feels are reals type culture, and it's just like the yes Chad memes, where it's just like he's it doesn't matter if he's wrong or not, he's just taking the most retarded position he can take and then just doubling down on it, and that's what makes you based in a sense. Like, I mean,
well,
I think we have
that's the
to do a
metric
little
for the
bit
new
more than
world,
that, yeah.
Ludwig Path. When we win, there's going to be a based counter imprinted into everyone's under your skin, right? It's going to be like that movie. Is that a Justin Timberlake movie where he has like a number printed on his skin? I don't think I've seen it, but I know the concept.
Something time.
Something with time, yes. And it's your base level. That's how it's going to work.
But the thing about the based meme, which I find services my point in a way, is that they can take the most ridiculous position, like you said. I can think of one off the top of my head. Going on about you can't just play video games all day and then go chase women in the street at 4 a.m. and there'll be the Chad guy that says yes, and that guy is effectively like put the dialectic further, because there will be people who want to unironically just take the boldness that this man asserts his position with, and suddenly it will have more validity than it did before. And that does more than him arguing ever would. I've seen people unironically adopt these positions, or at least sort of show sympathy towards it afterwards. And I think that's an interesting trick that we sort of have to adopt. If it were up to me, and I ran the BBC, back in the day, they used to have those things like air conditioning is sexist, for example, and people would go on and be laughed at, and then they just kept doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it. And suddenly people were genuinely found in the wild saying that air conditioning was indeed sexist. I mean, imagine the power if we could go on the BBC and just keep saying, yes, we believe this. And that was just projected to the masses uncritically day after day after day. In 10 years, I mean, I'd probably be scared of what the average person thought compared to me. It would go that far.
But I mean, to see like in their defense here, which I have to like be the guy who's sort of defending the woke. I mean, there is like, even though from like a pragmatic perspective, and like just from this reasoning existing in the world, pragmatic reasoning, like the idea of an air conditioner being sexist, it's absolute lunacy to anybody who's practical and agreeable and willing to try to work with other people. But like there is an actual argument there, because women's bodies and men's bodies are different in terms of temperature sensitivity, right? This is something
exactly what I mean.
Like,
it's been on the TV this much, even Ludwig's saying it.
Yeah, no, but it's true, right? I mean, it's no joke. You can look at this, like women and men do not have the same sensitivity to heat, right? And to sort of pretend that that's true, right? I mean, there is a sort of difference in terms of, I mean, like the problem is really in how detailed this is, and that's kind of like where the woke stuff comes in, is that you have to go into this insane nitty-gritty details and how every interaction works, and look at how like this is favoring like a white person by 2% or something. But it is a systemic issue in a sense. They're not wrong in noticing the details. I just have like, I think for the normie kind of like low IQ, low end of the bell curve, this is just offensive. Like it's just too much for them to have to sit and deal with being kind of hammered about how every action they're taking is going to have like some like minute effect on like some brown person who lives on the other side of the street or something. But in a sense, like the people who bring this up, they're not entirely wrong in how they're presenting it. I just have a completely different idea about where I want to go with things. But if their goal is like, okay, we are going to equalize everybody then you really have to be radical. Like Moldbug says, the things that has to be done to create, for them, let's just say their goal is like total equity. The kind of Martin Luther basic bitch speech, that's not enough. Like, we shall overcome this kind of the content of our character, not the color of our skin. It's not enough. It goes so much deeper than that. So if you really want to flatten the hierarchies, you have to like go into very, very heavy details on it, and we're gonna have to do the same things.
The problem is that going into that detail and flattening the hierarchies destroys the hierarchies.
Yeah, I'm not trying. I don't want to. Yeah, I'm not trying to destroy the hierarchies, but from like the left's perspective, that's what they're trying to do.
But that's why we have to push back, right?
Just to interject.
My pushback would be like, just for the air conditioning thing, rather than finding the perfect temperature that helps both men and women. How about just not have any women in the office?
Yes, exactly. That would be my approach as well.
As Nordanon says, without saying it, what Ludwig said could be turned into a pro-segregation argument.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and that's where I'm going with it. Is that basically okay, they are different, then women just have to work in a different office with a different air conditioning. That's the solution. Okay, we'll not do the combined spaces then, because we acknowledge we are woke in a sense. We have acknowledged that these things are different, woke. And we're super woke, and so we're just segregating. We realize that black and white people can't work together, so you're going to have your own space over there, and we're going to have the space over here. Like
the thing is though that what I was trying to really stab at is you are absolutely correct in that it is true, the difference between men and women. But what I am saying is, and what I saw on the ground, because it was a big thing in my circles, it just wouldn't have been countenanced or thought about. It would have been dismissed. If they'd have thought about it for more than 3 seconds, they probably would have said, yes, air conditioning is sexist if you think about it in a systemic, metaphysical, philosophical, esoteric, Hitlerist sense or whatever. But what I'm trying to say is it just would not have been thought about. That dialectic wasn't there. And they have successfully shifted it. Now, that is an achievement in itself, and there are positions that we have that we know are true that aren't countenanced and are dismissed, and we know this to be the case all the time, because just that knee-jerk reaction of, that's not what I've been told. Now, if we can do that the opposite way, then we can start changing things, and we can probably even get people to believe ridiculous things that just so happen to benefit our side of the arena. And that's really the power that I'm trying to emphasize, not whether it is true or not, but the fact that we can get people to believe it or not.
Yeah, that I do agree with. I agree 100%.
All right, I think on that note, we've been going for about 1.5 hours, which is now our time to end the shows. I don't see any questions jumping out at me in chat. Carl, where can people find more of your stuff if they're interested?
Currently, I'm a Praxarchy exclusive. You should probably get a subscription model going or something like that. That's where you can find me. I'm there and only there at this moment. Don't even have Twitter, but I'll see about expanding into perhaps the Twitter sphere and maybe create a Substack in the future. But for now, exclusively on Praxarchy. So thank you for having me.
So check out praxarchy.com. That's with an X and an CHY, Praxarchy. And Liquid Swan, where can people find your stuff?
Well, you can find me at praxarchy.com as well. I also have my own Substack, which you can find linked at that website at Praxarchy. And I'm on Twitter. I'm banned currently for another 5.5 days or so. I said some naughty words. But other than that, I have a YouTube channel as well. And I've been writing I'm going to be writing for the redensign.substack.com along with Black Horse. It's a new project sort of centered around Canadians not being cucks. So, this is a rare treat. So if you want to check that out, maybe find some history about Canada that's not about being pussies and
I think the Canadians they need all the morale boosts they can get. Right?
Yeah, we aren't all middle school drama teachers, so keep that in mind. Thanks for having me.
Ludwig Path. Anything you'd like to show?
The West has fallen. Follow me on Twitter.
You can follow me on Twitter as well to experience my shit posts and just pure unfiltered thoughts tweeted from the loo and write onto your demon brick at your convenience. Also, of course, if you for some reason made it this far and you haven't liked the video, you haven't commented, you haven't subscribed, please do all of that. That helps me a lot with the YouTube stuff. I saw that YouTube is doing a thing called podcasts where I can mark all our episodes as podcasts. So that's something that I will be trying out. I don't know how that really works, but if these episodes look different in your feed, that's probably why. There's the Longhouse Element group chat, which is like Discord, but it's more secure. You can come out and hang out and talk about the things we talk about, or chat with us. We'd love to have you there. Other than that, I don't think there's anything more to say. Hopefully all of you listening have a good weekend, and we'll see you next week, where we'll be talking about, I can't say this out loud in that way. I'm going to have to find a euphemism for YouTube. We're going to have to be talking about some neo windmill movements in the US, and how they have a tendency to get blown up from within, from people turning on their friends, etc. And we're going to be joined by the wonderful Thomas 777 to talk about that. So we'll see you then, and until then, have a good night and a good weekend, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.